Good morning, friends. My name is Shel Gross. I'm a member of Madison Friends Meeting in Madison, Wisconsin, and the presiding clerk for Northern Yearly Meeting. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our sessions today on changing structures for changing times. The very fact that so many of us are gathered online for this conference is a testament to our ability to change our structure to meet our times. Prior to the pandemic, some of us were using programs like Zoom to meet virtually, but I dare say that few of us have participated in large, multi-day conferences in the virtual space. And whether you embrace it or merely tolerate it, it has remained a part of how we do our business for reasons that go beyond the pandemic. I became involved in planning for this track for the same reason I suspect many of you are here. I'm seeing our monthly meeting and our yearly meeting struggle with getting folks to fill committee slots. There are lots of factors at work here, but sometimes we are just too whelmed, that's really a word, or even overwhelmed by what is right before us, to be able to see the bigger picture. So I'm glad that so many of you have decided to take the time today to step back and step into a different discussion about how we facilitate the work of the Spirit. I hope you are lifted up today in two senses of the word. Lifted up by our presenters so you can get above those things right in front of you and see that bigger picture. And perhaps find something or more than one thing that you might take back to your meetings. But also lifted up in the emotional and spiritual sense through connection with others struggling with the same concerns, all of which comes out of our love for our Quaker way of doing things. So let's go. We will have three presentations this morning. I'll introduce our presenters as we go along, and we'll have time for Q&A at the end. So all the questions are at the end. You can put your questions in the public chat so that those of us who are tracking that will be able to see them. And then if you have any tech questions, you can put something in the chat for the tech host. So our first presenter this morning is Barry Crossno, who has been the General Secretary of FGC for almost 13 years. And he'll be setting the stage for us today, focusing on the economic and sociologic context of contemporary Quaker experience and how it informs our future. I don't want to spend a lot of time on introductions. There's information on the website for that. But all of our presenters have a fascinating array of experiences, and I wanted to highlight a little bit of that. I found it interesting to learn that Barry spent 4 years with an international Buddhist institution, the Foundation for the Preservation of the Mahayana Tradition, and also 2 years at Pendle Hill. Across both his Buddhist and Quaker engagements, he is focused on developing tools and services to make these respective spiritual practices more accessible to people wherever they are. A good foundation for the work we are approaching today. Barry is a member of the monthly meeting of Friends of Philadelphia, sojourning with Cleveland Friends Meeting. And Barry, as you are ready, please go.
Thank you so much, Shel, for all you've done to organize this. So I'll be using, as you can see, a slide presentation. This is actually an abbreviated version of about a 60-minute presentation with a 30-minute discussion. I'll be offering that online again in the spring, the full version. But I felt that today, this abbreviated version can hopefully be really useful for context. Part of my hope is that if we understand our economic and social context a little better, then it will be easier for us to hear the leadings of spirit as a community, wherever they may take us. Next slide. And thank you to Kai Quirk, who is running the slides for me. Thank you, Kai. So, as friends, I want to acknowledge first that different meetings are in very different places. Some meetings are thriving right now. Many meetings are struggling. And so some of what I'm about to share may reflect where your meeting is. It may not. But I'll share that, the total number of FGC affiliated friends has been static for a number of decades until the past decade. We have started declining in numbers as best we can tell. I think, as most of us know, record keeping is and demography of attendance is not exactly a high priority for most of our meetings, but the data we do have says that we're starting to see a drop off, and the pandemic accelerated that. In addition to numbers starting to drop, our meetings have been navigating some new norms since the pandemic: hybrid worship, distance membership, a number of things such as that. Also, the FGC gathering and some yearly meeting annual sessions have also seen declining attendance. And there are often far fewer children at Quaker events and fewer children in most monthly meetings. FGC has sometimes struggled to fill committee vacancies, especially clerkships, and we have been hearing that from many clerks, whether at the monthly meeting level or the yearly meeting level, that they're also encountering that. And two, friends have grade. The average age has climbed significantly, which sets up a number of challenges for us. Next slide. So the way many monthly meetings are structured, including FGC and many of our yearly meetings, is that we, in order to do the discernment and the committee business as we have structured it, we're often very reliant upon middle class friends with disposable income and free time. That also requires that these friends have a significant awareness and experience of Quaker cultural and spiritual practices and history. Friends who can commit to regular meetings, both for program implementation and for governance of their monthly meeting or yearly meeting. Two, this is often requires friends who have a comfort level for committee work that is sometimes centralizing or very deliberative. And there can be multiple layers of seasoning depending on the size of the organization. And with all of that goes friends who will choose to navigate white middle class norms and biases. The point I want to make is that these characteristics do not necessarily describe the majority of the general population. And that's very much a piece of our falling numbers. But why is it happening? What are some of the things that are contributing to this unfolding? Next slide. So let's start with the economic piece. A lot of what I'm going to share with you today is not new to you. You have been hearing these things. What I'm attempting to do is to put a lot of these pieces in the same spot in order to paint a picture for us to consider. So on the left-hand side of the slide, you're seeing something called the Gini index. Basically, it's a measure of income inequality. The lower the trough, the better. As you can see, the Gini index, the trough was at its lowest from essentially the late 40s to around 1980. And then you see it start climbing steadily through the 80s and 90s. What you don't see from this slide, because this slide is a few years old, is that the Gini index has actually climbed significantly since the pandemic. So it's now at a level that has not been seen since the Great Depression. With income inequality comes a real strain for those who, essentially for anyone who's not in the upper income brackets. Both lower and middle income folks have seen a real strain. Then if you move to the slide on your right, part of what you're seeing, and this is kind of an astonishing statistic, and I'll share that depending on what sources you check, and I checked a number of sources, the number is slightly different, but it's not so significantly different as to really change the underlying truth. So 80% of Americans share 77% of all the money in America. Think about that astonishing idea that income inequality has stretched to the point that the vast majority of wealth is now concentrated in a very small percentage of hands. And part of what this income inequality sets up, and we'll get into this in later slides, is, and I experienced this anecdotally talking to other parents and talking to younger friends, is that there is this sense of fear and competition for what there is, and that it sets up a number of decisions about where your time goes, and also how you might, what schooling you think is necessary, a whole series of decisions that affect the broader life and the broader choices that families make. Let's go to the next slide. So, along with that income inequality, it's not simply that it's hitting everybody. What I think we know, but this graph, this chart really demonstrates, is that income inequality is hitting generations very differentially. So, my mother's generation had almost a 90% chance of making more income than their parents, which is kind of astonishing. As you'll see, each generation, um, early boomers, later boomers, Gen X, which I'm Gen X, I was born in 1969, and then, of course, millennials and running on to Gen Z, you'll see that the percentage of people who make more than their parents has continued to slide. Um, and in many cases, it's a toss up as whether you might actually reach the income that your parents have reached based on a whole number of decisions. Let's go to the next slide. So, part of what this is set up beyond decisions about schooling and vocation is issues of free time. Um, there are many people who are working far more hours in order to make ends meet. But what you also see too has been a steady rise in dual income households. Now, there's really important positive things about dual income households. The reason why I'm bringing it into the mix, though, is just an understanding of how the landscape has changed in terms of free time. As we think about committee structures and the things we ask people to do in order to be part of meeting communities that are highly reliant upon current structures. As you'll see, the percentage of dual income households has increased from 47% to about 2010, you get to around 66%. I looked for some statistics in various places, and as best I can tell, it's been hovering between 65 and 70% for the decades since then. This, of course, dramatically changes free time availability, which is demonstrated in the next slide over, which is on the well, actually, if you could, I'm sorry, Kai, if you could jump back, go back 2 slides. There we go. Thank you. So the volunteer rate for all age groups. This is a comparison from 1974 is the blue line, 89 is the red line with squares, 2005, and then 2015 is the stars. On the surface of it, it may not look like dramatic changes, but in some ways it really is dramatic, because what you will see is the volunteer rate for people aged 65 and over has climbed from 14% in 1974 to in 2015 it was 22%. And again, different data sources say different things, but right now it seems that this truth seems to be the same, if not even a little more exaggerated. So lots of nonprofits are seeing older volunteers. Our own meetings are seeing this. But I want to go back for you to look at the age group of 35 to 44. You'll see in 34% of people who volunteered in 1974 in that age bracket, and you go down to 2015 and it's 27%. Now, if you think of it in terms of the percentage of population, and you also look at the 25 and 34% bracket, what you're actually talking about is roughly a third less volunteers in those age brackets. for all nonprofits. I realize there's population changes, but as a percentage of the population, that amount of people changing their volunteer patterns has real significance for us in terms of an egalitarian society that relies heavily on volunteerism. Let's move to the next slide. The other piece is this title actually comes from something that a friend said to me in passing. They were like, "Where did all the children go?" And one of the things simply to keep in mind, and again, this is multifaceted. It's complex. There's some very good reasons for the birth rate to have changed, but the birth rate has changed significantly from the 1960s until now. And in particular, you'll notice that um, early boomer generation and even later boomer generation, often the average number of children in a family is significantly higher than it's been for my generation, for millennials, and the pattern for Gen Z holds. So demographically, there's simply a shift in the number of children. The reasons behind that, again, are complex: income inequality, periodic recessions, declining availability of public services, career empowerment for all genders, and also some folks are carrying environmental concerns. But from whatever direction it's coming, there's simply a change in numbers that, and part of what you'll see, and what I've seen when I look at FGC's database and pull attendance numbers, is that the the children of boomers, many of them were coming of age in the 80s, 90s, early aughts, which corresponds with high tide for children's attendance at the FGC gathering, and with some monthly and yearly meeting children attendance. So there's pieces of this that really demographic changes are impacting. Let's go to the next slide. But it's not all that. It's not simply demographic changes. It's also changes that are occurring because of socioeconomic pressures. So one of the things you'll see on the left hand of this slide is it talks about socialization. This is from Pew Research Center. But the most important piece I want you to look at on that slide is the top line where it says education plus 18% more time, leisure right underneath it, negative 24% for teens during that time period. If anything, it's gotten a little worse. So what you're seeing is a dramatic fall in free time for teens and young adults. And that also translates into where they're putting their time. But a piece to keep in mind as well is when you see that plus 18 number, anecdotally, what that ties to for me are a number of parents that I've talked with who have said, "Oh, do you think y'all will be coming to the gathering this year?" And they'll say, "Well, I felt like our choice was the gathering or robotics camp this summer, and we've chosen robotics camp." And that's multifaceted. One is a time pressure, but the other is all of the energy being poured into education is around concerns of social mobility. And you see that in the admission rates over here on colleges. I recognize that on the right-hand side, this is a graph that is tracking the Ivy League colleges, but in doing some of the research, this graph, this dramatic decline in admission rates, is also reflected in a lot of the state schools as well. So the competition is real, and families are having to shift where they put their time and their money in order to try and compensate for those pieces. And sometimes what happens is they're shifting their priorities away from children's activities that would normally happen in meeting. Let's go to the next slide, please. Now, again, it's not just demographic changes. It's not time constraints. There's also, and it's not also academic pressure. It's essentially the appeal of Western religion is fading for young adults. That's also a big piece of this puzzle. And you can see it really dramatically in this slide. The percentage of people who are unaffiliated by age climbs dramatically this is 2016. I looked at some other data. It's a little bit higher. Pew is actually saying it might be more like 40% now of youth 18 to 29 are unaffiliated. religiously at this time. That's a dramatic shift. Why is that happening? Let's go to the next slide. So, this is from the Atlantic and from some other sources, and we talk about these things. So again, this is not new, but I'm just trying to put it into a package for you. That one of the biggest pieces is the fading moral authority of churches. It's a huge piece of the puzzle. Sex abuse scandals, indigenous boarding schools, which we've brought up in these sessions, advocacy of war and colonialism, homophobia, gender discrimination, blindness to income inequality. I have seen that talked a lot in church circles, that there are many congregations that are deeply blind to income inequality and its impacts. And that really shows up, especially for younger adults, as a pain point, along with all these other pieces. I could go on, but that's a huge piece. Also, there's the association of evangelicals with the political right that has happened over the past 30 to 40 years that drives political liberals from mainstream churches, not just conservative churches. It's an interesting knock-on effect of people over political issues are not simply disassociating with churches that lean right, they're just disassociating with organized religion. Um, there's also the way social and economic inequality has delayed child rearing among Gen X and millennials that has led to gaps in church attendance. Um, I will say personally, I fit in some while church attendance was not a gap for me. I will say that I am 54 years old and have a 4-year-old. Earlier in my life, it did not seem possible for me to have children. This is a discussion point among many Gen X and many millennials, and definitely a part of our reality. Also, the denial of science and discriminatory doctrines has driven many from religious participation over the years. And also, changes in modern work hours, especially for service industry workers, make Sunday church community participation difficult or impossible. And then this one really struck me. An Atlantic article really went into some depth about this. The irrelevance of church concerns and practices to everyday life for some people is something we really need to sit with. Next slide. I realize I'm running low on time, so I'll try and wrap this up. This piece I want to show you as just a way of driving home how the political perceptions among younger adults really has an impact on whether they choose to walk through the door of a religious congregation. So this is from Springgate, which is a research group about religion in young adults. They did some surveys around values gaps. And so, among the young adults that they surveyed, let's say with gender equity, 77% of young adults said, I care about this. They were then asked, do you think religious people care about this issue? Only 52% of them said that we think religious people who are attending church, care about that issue. You see that pattern repeated all the way down on any number of issues: lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer rights. You see it with immigration rights, income inequality. There are these huge value gaps between Gen Z and what they think about churches and church-going people. Next slide. So, where do we go from here? So, are the there are many ways that Quaker culture and polity and structures could change. We will see where we are led. What I'm going to offer up are some observations and then some possible solutions, just things for us, talking points essentially. So, as traditionally structured Quaker volunteerism becomes more difficult to sustain, um, more Quaker meetings might give consideration to part-time childcare and religious education staff that can provide the continuity necessary for meaningful community experiences. Um, Two, for many teens, the Quaker experience is long on community activities and fairly short on theology, spiritual practice tools, and opportunities for leadership. This needs to shift. And there's a lot more about children and teens. Emily Provence, who's been attending this conference, and many of you know, she's been doing a lot of work on this, and I encourage you to take a look at her website and some of what she has to say around these issues. Um, also want to lift up that robust religious education experience is paramount to retain and create meaning for newcomers. Um, Two, I would I want us to really consider a shift in the way we think about outreach and visibility. Um, I think it's very important for us to consider that visibility should be seen as a service to those who seek an alternative to traditional Western religion. Many of us who are religious refugees, if you will, um, need to consider visibility and to hopefully stop equating visibility and outreach with proselytization. I know our history can make that difficult, but if we hold on to the what in my mind is the false paradigm of conflating proselytization and outreach or proselytization and visibility, given our societal trends, it will lead to many Quaker meetings folding over the coming decades. Um, and part of the reason for that, if you go back into the demographics that I was sharing with you, there was a time when people might become disaffected with the religion in which they were raised, and then they would go out and seek another religion. What is happening now is that people are disaffected and they're not looking for an alternative religion. So if we're wanting to communicate to people that the value system that we have in place reflects where they are, we're going to actively need to share that reality with people. They're not going to seek us out. Um, Also, I think we need to consider how meeting itself can be more meaningful for people who are feeling time pressured, who are feeling economically pressured. There's a lot around small group work that we could do. There's a lot of data showing that small group work is really, really important to people having meaningful experiences. For us, that can look like faithfulness group, anchor committee, worship sharing groups, clearness groups, experiments with a light, which many of you have been experiencing this weekend. Thank you, Joanne Seaver. Um, and also, I just want to lift up that we rely on committee and group discernment to operate, build community, and experience the leadings of spirit. This relies heavily on, as someone in an earlier group, Jennifer, lifted up, time privilege. So, can we weave community building into the fabric of worship itself? I will share that some traditionally unprogrammed meetings since COVID have gone semi programmed so that there is worship sharing, and other community building experiences without the need for people to show up early, stay late, or come another day, or to take on committee assignments in order to have interactions with other friends. Um, and taking on those extra pieces is often especially difficult for parents, young adults, and the 10% of American adults right now, 16 million people, who are estimated to be working two jobs. So there's also a piece that pastoral care for major life events such as births, deaths, marriages, and commencement are highly variable across meetings. So how do we think about how we provide more consistent pastoral care in our meetings that is also a piece of people feeling like they have joined a community that they can journey with over time? Um, and a last piece, and I've heard this talked about by a number of friends, is can we reimagine how we support friends with leadings? Often the process requires meeting unity, which can take months or years to gain. And this has led to widespread disaffection among those who are most often called to serve the community. How can this look different? So, again, some ideas, some things for us to perhaps ponder, and I will leave it there. Thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity to share with you and look forward to questions that may unfold later in the Q&A.
Thank you, Barry. I had heard about your presentation. It's the first I heard it, and I don't know if it will make people feel less well, but it may allow people to have a better understanding about how they're feeling, what they're feeling. So thanks so much for that. Great kickoff. Next, we're going to hear from Paul Buckley. Paul is a member of Clear Creek Friends Meeting in Richmond, Indiana. I connected with him when I learned that he was the convener of the Restructuring Committee for Ohio Valley Yearly Meeting. And they ambitiously met with all of their monthly meetings to learn what they wanted from the yearly meeting. And I trust that Paul's talk will be informed by what he learned from that experience. I also learned Paul is also a prolific writer, including several books each on William Penn and Elias Hicks, various publications related to how Quakers read scripture, and a relatively new Pendle Hill pamphlet, Quaker Testimony, What We Witness to the World. So, Paul, as you are ready, please take it over.
Hello, friends. I'm delighted to be with you today. This is perhaps the strangest presentation I've ever given to a Quaker gathering. It is a fable. Once upon a time, there was a very tired yearly meeting nominating committee. It felt it was faced with an impossible task, so it set aside its monthly meeting in February 2022 to regroup. During that meeting, the committee laid out its concerns in a report to the yearly meeting's executive committee. They wrote, quote, "It is not within the scope of our authority to make changes to the yearly meeting structure. But we feel that continuing to try to fill the current roster is setting us up for failure and potentially requiring too much time and effort to be put into work that does not serve the yearly meeting well." In preparation for our discussion, a document was created that listed all the current officers, administrators, representatives to other organizations, and committees. It is 9 pages long and lists 6 officers, 6 administrators, 12 committees named by the nominating committee with at least 63 members, 20 representatives to 7 organizations, and 5 other committees that are not named by the nominating committee. We believe it to be complete and accurate. It is likely that this roster has never been completely staffed, certainly not in the memory of those living. If you were doing the mental arithmetic, you will know that's a total of 107 positions to be nominated. Coincidentally, adult registration for the 2021 annual sessions had been 107. The report went on to discuss some consequences of naming so many people to yearly meeting responsibilities and suggested some areas where reductions might be made. It noted, quote, "A related issue is the degree to which individual monthly meetings feel connected to or involved in the work of the yearly meeting. It is difficult to recruit people for our committees or other posts if they do not know how the job affects them and their local meetings. Some of the largest monthly meetings have few, if any, people on a yearly meeting committee or who attend the annual sessions. Many monthly meeting members have no experience beyond their own local meeting. Meetings and members who do not experience the yearly meeting as providing valuable service are not likely to be involved with it." The report ended by reiterating this is work beyond the bounds of the nominating committee, although it greatly impacts our work. We are approaching the executive committee for guidance. The report was well received by the executive committee at its meeting later in February. In discussion, a good number of questions were posed, including, are there too many committees? Are there functions that the yearly meeting is attempting to do that it should not? Are standing committees the best way to get the work done? One member of the executive committee commented that she really didn't know what the yearly meeting needs to be doing or how it is currently being done, and this may be the case for many others. She felt that even those who are involved in the work of the yearly meeting may feel there is no shared vision of its work. It was clear that the executive committee did not have the resources or the time to take up this concern. One early suggestion was that the nominating committee put aside its regular work and spend a year seeking solutions. Bureaucratic equivalent of shoot the messenger. Eventually, it was decided to appoint an ad hoc committee. It was a good committee consisting of the yearly meeting presiding clerk, former presiding clerk of another yearly meeting, a yearly meeting staff member, the yearly meeting website administrator, a longtime clerk of the Peace and Social Concerns Committee, and of course, the woman who said she didn't know what the yearly meeting needs to be doing. The messenger was not shot. He was named co-clerk. At its first meeting, the new ad hoc restructuring committee acknowledged that it didn't know the feelings of the yearly meeting members well enough and sketched out a plan for visiting monthly meetings. These visits were intended to be undertaken in a spirit of open listening. Our initial guide was the question, if Ohio Valley yearly meeting didn't exist, why would we want to create it? We wanted to be sure that the visits included younger people in our monthly meetings and those who are not currently involved in the yearly meeting. It was decided to offer to send a team of 2 to each meeting for a listening session. Over the next few months, 4 documents were developed. 1, a letter outlining our task and asking for invitations from the monthly meetings. 2, a set of suggested questions and prompts for the visitors to use, including the following thought experiment. Suppose you have just discovered that there are roughly 500 other Quakers in similar local meetings within driving distance. What would you like to do with them? 3, a brief description of the work and services of the yearly meeting. And 4, a post-visit report form to guide visitors in writing complete and consistent reports. We reported on our plans to the 2022 Ohio Valley Yearly Meeting annual sessions, starting with, quote, our concern is that as it is currently structured and staffed, Ohio Valley Yearly Meeting seems unable to accomplish what it says it wants to do. As a yearly meeting, we seem unclear what God is calling us to do, and the committee feels that Ohio Valley Yearly Meeting needs to discern what that is. Such discernment can only be accomplished as a body, including people who do not attend our annual sessions. We propose that 2 or 3 people be sent to each monthly meeting, in person or virtually. The purpose of the visits is simply to listen to and see what themes and priorities emerge. This report was greeted with support and encouragement. In July, the letter seeking invitations was sent to all monthly meeting clerks, the clerks of monthly meeting ministry and council committees, and monthly meeting representatives to the executive committee. By the end of September, several visits had been completed. Visitors' initial reactions were that their visits were very enjoyable and uplifting experiences, and almost all friends who stayed for a listening session already were or have been actively involved in the life and work of the yearly meeting. Eventually, we were able to visit about 2/3 of the monthly meetings in the yearly meeting. 5 concerns were most often raised. 1, how can we facilitate joint action across monthly meetings on environmental and social concerns? 2, the value of quarterly meetings as currently structured was doubtful. 3, there was a desire for more communications, especially from the yearly meeting to the monthly meetings, rather than from monthly meetings to the yearly meeting. 4, The monthly meetings needed support. Visitors are very welcome, but meetings were much more open to being visited than to visiting. 5, it was also widely reported that friends were experiencing extreme burnout. Monthly and quarterly meetings were having difficulty in filling their own positions. At its meeting in February 2023, the ad hoc committee reviewed the visitor reports. We wondered whether it would help if the yearly meeting hired additional paid staff to attend to some of the work that was draining the energy of some yearly meeting members. 3 working groups were created to focus on quarterly meetings, social action work, and adding staff. It should be noted that the committee had not met for 4 months between October and February. This was due in part to the energy put into monthly meeting visits and the impingement of the holidays, but was more due to a lack of leadership by the co-clerks. As a result, the time available to generate and nurture possible responses to the concerns raised in the meeting visits was greatly diminished. There were less than 4 months before the annual sessions in mid-June 2023. In that time, a proposal was developed to redefine and reorganize the yearly meetings, peace, justice, earth care, and social action work. This was based on the assumption that the yearly meeting is not just an assemblage of discrete monthly meetings, nor is it a super monthly meeting duplicating the work of a monthly meeting on a larger scale. Instead, it was proposed that most outward activity takes place in the monthly meetings, and the yearly meeting's principal role should be to empower, support, cross-fertilize, and encourage the monthly meetings. But who would do it? Initially, it seemed that this work could be assigned to existing yearly meeting committees, but it quickly became clear that adding more tasks to the job descriptions of tired committees was a bad idea. Instead, we recommended that the yearly meeting name a Peace, Justice, Earth Care, and Social Action Coordinator to assist the monthly meetings. This person would facilitate communication between monthly meetings regarding current activities and new leadings, create opportunities for activists in the monthly meetings to meet, talk, and plan together, and to act as a conduit for information on local activities to the whole membership of the yearly meeting. Although the possibility of this being a paid staff position was discussed, we felt that the role was not well enough defined and that a year or 2 of experience would determine whether that was necessary. Crucially, rather than duplicating the work of the yearly meeting Earth Care and Peace and Social Concerns committees, it was proposed that these committees be laid down. In those same months, the working group on the status and functions of quarterly meetings sought a way forward. While many friends had expressed serious doubts about the value of the quarterly meetings, others believed there was unrealized potential that was checked by the current structure. Generally speaking, quarterly meeting sessions are poorly attended, and many of those who attend seem to have little or no understanding of the status and functions of quarterly meetings. Moreover, since the particular friends in attendance changes significantly with each session, continuity is difficult to maintain. On the other hand, quarterly meeting sessions can provide opportunities for intervisitation. Hosting a quarterly meeting can reduce the sense of isolation that smaller and more remote monthly meetings often experience, and remind friends that they are part of a religious society larger than their local meeting. In the face of these cross currents, this working group was unable to produce any recommendations for the yearly meeting to consider. On June 15, 2023, the proposed redirection of the yearly meeting's social action energies and the assessment of the quarterly meetings were given a first reading. This generated some questions and discussion, but action was postponed to allow friends to reflect on the proposal and its implications. In a second reading 2 days later, the redefinition of the role of the yearly meeting to coordinate, empower, and support was embraced. But most remarks from the floor focused on whether to lay down the Earth Care Committee. The idea of naming a social action coordinator was generally supported, but it was doubted that a volunteer could be found who was capable of doing the work. As is common among friends, discussion was wide-ranging. At one point, it was even suggested that this task could be assigned to the quarterly meetings. In the end, 2 minutes were approved. First, to lay down the inactive Peace and Social Concerns Committee, and second, an expanded ad hoc restructuring committee was asked to keep working. The moral of the story. This was not the outcome that we hoped for, but there are lessons to be learned. First, and most importantly, we learned that too much communication is not enough. The visits to individual monthly meetings were essential to the process, but the failure to adequately engage the Earth Care Committee ahead of the presentation at annual sessions doomed the proposal to create a social action coordinator. Second, don't change existing structures before new ones are in place and functioning well. The idea of redefining the role of the yearly meeting to empower, support, cross-fertilize, and encourage action by the monthly meetings rather than doing things itself was well received in principle, but was derailed by proposing that the existing committees be laid down before setting up a working replacement. Third, people don't resist change. They resist being changed. We proposed a solution, I still believe a good solution, to be imposed by the yearly meeting. If instead the existing committees and other social activists had been more involved in defining the problems and finding ways to address them, we may have come to the same solution or a better one. Fourth, appointing co-clerks handicapped the process. Shared responsibility is often no responsibility. They were building something new, but the two individuals never sat down to coordinate their work. While they did not act at cross purposes, they did not build on each other's strengths. Fifth, never adjourn a meeting without agreeing when to reconvene, or at least with a clear understanding of how and who will set that time. Sixth, had there been one missed meeting, it would have been unremarkable, but allowing the gap to stretch to 4 months meant that the subsequent process was rushed. This led directly to inadequate communication with the Earth Care Committee and others, and the subsequent failure in the annual sessions. So our current work. The membership of the ad hoc committee was augmented last summer. The current clerk of one quarterly meeting, the immediate past clerk of the other quarter, and a member of the Earth Care Committee were added. It has met every month for the past half year. We've mostly put our energies into considering the functions and responsibilities of the quarterly meetings. As part of that work, the involvement of the quarters was invited with full presentations on the work in progress to each quarter. At our most recent meeting, the ad hoc committee united on short descriptions of our work, on encouraging communications between monthly meetings, and on a revised and much simpler proposal for a social action coordinator. These will be printed in the next issue of the yearly meeting newsletter. Whether we have learned our lessons will not be revealed until the next annual sessions. The end for now.
Thank you, Paul. That was wonderful. I hope my intro didn't ruin the premise that you were telling us a fable about something somewhere else. I'm sure people figure it out.
Just can't catch them off guard. That's what you want to do.
I suspect that's going to generate lots of food for thought for people. I have lots of notes about stuff from there, so thank you so much. Okay, let's take a breath. And move on to our last presentation. So I was talking about our presenters having an array of experiences. Rashid Darden is a member of Friends Meeting of Washington and Associate Secretary for Communications and Outreach for Friends General Conference. He is also a novelist who focuses on the Black LGBT experience, whether in contemporary fiction or in urban fantasy. And he has also been an alternative school educator, teaching writing and language arts to teenagers and young adults, most recently at Youth Build DC Public Charter School. Based on his Quaker Speak video, which was one of the past year's top 5, he has a lot to offer us as we think about how Quakers might reimagine our place in the faith world and how that might speak to changing structures for these changing times. Rashid, please go when you're ready.
Thank you so much. This has been pre-recorded because I ramble, so I needed I needed some guardrails. And what I didn't put in the slideshow is that if you are interested in restorative Quaker design, I will be leading a workshop about it at this summer's gathering. So shameless plug for the gathering. Without further ado, Kai, feel free to push play. Thank you. My name is Rashid. This is Restorative Quaker Design, a new way for a new day. Before I otherwise forget, I want to convey to you the key messages I'd like to share today. The first and main message is that I'd like to introduce you to something you might find new called Restorative Quaker Design, a method of anti-racist problem solving for meetings to handle big problems. And I mainly want to also convey that I'd like meetings to be able to expand their skill sets in order to solve the future's problems and to think beyond Quaker process to do the solving. Restorative Quaker design is an anti-racist method of problem solving within the Religious Society of Friends. It provides a framework by which all voices may be heard and all potential solutions may be considered. It requires trust in one another, in the community, and in the process. It allows for predetermined strategies to confront and work through conflict rather than avoiding it. Restorative Quaker design begins and ends with worship, trusts the voice of God, and believes that God provides evidence and verification along the way. Restorative Quaker design is a blend of 3 well-established traditions or methodologies. The first is restorative practices, then Quaker decision-making, and finally design thinking. I was introduced to all 3 methodologies when I was in my 30s. I was introduced to Quaker decision-making as a convinced friend, and I was introduced to both restorative practices and design thinking as a teacher in the District of Columbia Public Charter Schools, focusing on alternative schools. I want to take a brief interlude and tell you how I went from a skeptic to a believer in restorative practices. So, although this entire presentation is about restorative Quaker design, A lot of it is about restorative practices, and I'm going to tell you the briefest of stories about how I went from a skeptic to a believer in restorative practices, which opened up my mind to be led to create Restorative Quaker Design. I was a teacher in DC public charter schools, always alternative schools, always kids that had previously dropped out from traditional learning settings. And I worked at one school which was, frankly, objectively horrible and is the only DC public charter school to open and close in the same year. And they gave us resources for restorative practices, but they didn't give us any training. So we'd have a fight in the morning, a conference, and the kids would be back in school the next day still fighting. So we were failing at restorative practices. But then when I learned lessons from other schools in radical candor, innovation, and risk taking, and finally landed at the last school at which I worked, in which relationships were deep, I had the revelation there that it's not necessarily the book learning about restorative practices that make you a practitioner. It's about the relationships and trust you build within a community. And that is a supreme lesson for us to learn in Quaker meetings. There is no methodology that's going to work without the trust and care and support of your meetings. So let's delve a little deeper. What I learned when I first started teaching restorative Quaker design is that Quakers are not a stranger to restorative practices, as I once suspected. Many of us have been exposed to restorative practices through our children, and because we've been educators, or because restorative practices are part of our various peace building activities. But what I want everybody to know, if you've heard anything about restorative practices, it's not just about circles. Circles are one of the practices in restorative practices. Restorative practices are a decades-old social science based in part in indigenous practices, but is not a wholly indigenous practice, that studies the improvement and repair of relationships between people and groups and communities. Restorative practices, including but not limited to restorative justice, proactively build communities that are socially and emotionally healthy, build people and groups with increased social capital, decreases crime and behavior typically deemed problematic, and of course repairs harm and restores relationships between people after harm. Some examples of restorative practices include inquiries and check-ins rather than accusations, conversations with a lot of candor, conferences, restorative circles, and really about the mindset of having a positive, assuming a positive outcome, or having a win-win scenario in the face of conflict or harm. I'm going to do something on this slide that I rarely do in presentations. I'm going to leave this up here, but I'm going to talk about something entirely different. One of my concerns with our community as Quakers is that we have a lot of resources at our fingertips that we feel reluctant to bring into our Quaker spaces because we think there's only one way to be a Quaker. Well, being a Quaker in the schools that I worked, I was able to bring Quaker practice into my classroom to have a much more peaceful experience than if I had no faith practice to speak of. But more specifically, there are things that I learned in those environments that I could and do bring to the Quaker space that are helpful, that can build community, that can undo white supremacy, that can do things with a high level of control of the group and a high level of support of the group, which is the basis of restorative practices as seen on the graphic on the right. It's not just about schooling. And what concerns me is if our children are being taught restorative practices and have been taught restorative practices, what happens when they go into the real world and leave high school and leave college and all of a sudden nobody's restorative anymore? Nobody is having these conversations. We're branding them as soft. as opposed to being young adults that can actually bring about the peace and change that we've been, searching for in the world. So, my goal and part of my ministry is to bring these practices to the good grown adults of the Quaker world and help everybody get caught up to speed with what our students, children, and young adults already have mastered because they've been doing it since they've been in kindergarten. We now shift to Quaker process, which we don't have to get into here. We know that fundamentally Quaker process is not just silence. Quaker process is a spiritual experience in which we come to unity on what we feel God would have us do in a given scenario. What I would push back on, what many of you have heard me push back on, is that I don't think God cares about the color of the curtains. I think that Quaker process is best used in places and spaces that need God's presence. When you look up design thinking and a definition for it, you might see a lot of reference to commerce, capitalism, and products and inventions. But the process of design thinking is not just about products, it's about services and it's about solutions. So walk with me, if you will, through design thinking. Design thinking is a process for problem solving. It utilizes a process of understanding a problem, brainstorming and choosing possible solutions, testing and refining those solutions, and implementing the solutions. Although design thinking can be implemented in a number of ways, the American Marketing Association and other organizations acknowledges the 5 phases of design thinking to be empathize, define, ideate, prototype, and test. Note that nowhere here does it say that the outcome has to be a product or a building, although those things are certainly the outcome of many design thinking processes. You can also prototype a system. You can also prototype a mindset and a way of thinking and being within your meetings and in your communities. We're now ready to discuss the 10 steps of restorative Quaker design. They are worship, self-identification, problem identification, brainstorming, prototyping, testing, refinement, rollout, evaluation, and worship. As friends, we should always begin and end our complex processes with worship to make sure we're on the right track and to ensure that what we're embarking on is what God would have us to do. That method is in traditional Quaker process and should be led, if it was up to me, by the clerk or co-clerks of the meeting. Self-identification can be done through a workshop, conference, guest speaker, but this is where the anti-racist rubber meets the racist road. Here's what I mean by that. In order for the entire restorative Quaker design process to be anti-racist, you have to know who you are first. You have to know who your meeting is. You have to know your blind spots. And you have to be committed to being anti-racist if this anti-racist process is to work. If you skip this part, you run the risk of prototyping and brainstorming and implementing a process that could irreparably harm your meeting and the community around it, all because you didn't take the time to get the best available anti-racist training and understanding to help you do what you need to do as a meeting. After that process, then you begin the process of identifying your meeting's problems? Well, it's easy to identify problems because if you're like me, a chronic complainer, you could identify them by yourself. But only in community can you determine what is the underlying problem of the things that you wish to solve in your community. And that can be done through a restorative circle. And there are books, there are workshops, there are videos, and I have some recommendations for you on my website that can be your first steps toward restorative circles in your meetings. I also want to say, everything we do is Quaker because we are Quakers, but every process doesn't have to be a Quaker process if that is not the best possible practice in a given scenario. So, worship is good, but the ritualism and the formality of a circle can help define and refine these important conversations. Parts 4, 5, and 6 are brainstorming, prototyping, and testing. Brainstorming is fun because for all the complaining we might do, there are also lots and lots and lots of solutions. Every solution might not be the answer, but you can lead or co-lead a fun, facilitated brainstorming session that gets everybody in the room thinking about how they might solve a given problem. And one of the best parts of brainstorming is finding how similar everyone's solutions are and just how out there they can be. But the most out there ideas with the right funding could actually solve your problem. And the right ideas could also be free. So don't think that you have to have $1 million idea to solve your problem. It might be worth $1 million to you, but doesn't have to cost that much. The prototyping stage can be complicated, but it can be fun to build something in your community that solves the problem. So this is sort of nebulous, but walk with me. Your solution to your problem could be as simple as we want to institute guidelines for worship in our meeting. You draft, you test those guidelines, and I'm sorry, I skipped the testing. You draft those, you can do it as a workshop or a work day, in committee meetings, whatever ways work for you and your meeting can help prototype the first draft of this solution. And then we get to testing. Then we use small groups. Then we figure out, is this terrible? I don't know. It could work, but let's try it on a smaller group first to reduce the harm, the potential harm. After the prototyping, you get back in circles, in restorative circles with your participants to have a guided and orderly conversation about the prototyping experience. It is collaborative, it is open, it is honest, there is candor. We're not gossiping, we are talking to each other about how this thing went. And you may have to go back to prototyping and refinement several times before you go to a rollout, part 8, a rollout to the entire group. And I recommend repeating steps 6 and 7 until you feel comfortable enough to roll out a whole meeting solution. Step 9, evaluate, evaluate, evaluate. Use surveys, use focus groups, and my preferred method, if one can afford it, get external evaluators to look at what you have created and let them lead the process so that there's more transparency and there is more honesty in the reporting. And finally, the process ends with worship, which can be celebratory, which can be reflective, and which could even be, I think God is telling us that this was a flop. And that's okay too. In summary, your Quaker problems may be big and your Quaker problems may be complicated. I do not believe that you can have the same methods to solve the problems of 2024 that we had in 1984. So try using additional tools, adding them to your toolkit, and using them under the framework of restorative Quaker design, which takes from many traditions to solve problems. And the most important tool you'll need is time. You can't expect to solve big and complicated problems overnight. Don't neglect your anti-racist training in this process or any other, because you need to understand your own biases to prevent you from causing harm in your solutions. And by all means, ask for help in implementing any of the steps that we've discussed today. FGC is available for some of those things. I'm available for some of those things. Many anti-racist trainers and evaluators are available in your communities as well. And some of those resources are linked from the website that I'll share on the final slide. Hey, you want to learn more about this topic? You can visit my website, rashidopedia.com/RQD. You can contact me via phone, always text first. Or you can email me at my personal email address, rashid.darden@gmail.com. Those are how you can reach me on Restorative Quaker Design. For all other matters, please reach me through the FGC website.
Thank you for that, and thanks for recording that first. That's a nice tactic, strategy we should think about. So we do have some time left, which is great. There was a question somebody asked, Barry, related to your discussion about including community building and worship, and whether you have other examples of what that might look like.
Some examples of well, I'll share that there's a meeting in Philadelphia that when I was last in Philly, some members of the meeting were talking with me about one of their shifts, which is that they have chosen to take the worship time to 90 minutes. And the first half hour is actually worship sharing. So they're doing worship sharing exercises as an opening to meeting for worship. And they said that they did that in part as a response to COVID. That a lot of the members of the meeting said they felt like they had, in some ways, fallen out of relationship with each other, and that they really needed an opportunity to hear from each other in a deep and spiritual way. And so the worship sharing queries have been a way for members of the meeting to come into deeper relationship with one another, and they feel like it's been quite successful. So that's one example in practice. There have been a couple of other meetings that have built religious education into that worship period. There are some places that they worship for half an hour and they spend a half an hour rotating various possibilities. In the other half hour, worship sharing is one. The answering of queries is another. Various types of RE. So I think there's a number of ways that you could choose to structure or restructure a meeting for worship in a semi-programmed method. And of course, there have been those that have integrated song and poetry and art and movement as experiments at times, and sometimes not an experiment. There was one meeting that for many years they had time for singing and hymns as a standing part of their practice. So I think there's a variety of methodologies that can be explored and utilized. But for me, the basis of it is using whatever means. It's an attempt to try and both deepen us with spirit and also to weave a fabric um, in the community. So, what is it that's going to facilitate us getting to know each other in a deeper and more meaningful and purposeful way?
Paul, I will direct this one to you, although others may have a comment, because I think it was related to your discussion about monthly meeting folks getting together. And do people have experiences with monthly meetings getting together? just for fun, not necessarily for a quarterly business meeting. Do you have some perspective on that?
Well, I can tell you that in the latest draft of our proposal, that's one of the elements. We don't know of that happening on a formal basis. Of course, there are monthly meetings, particularly those that are geographically close together, that gather for various reasons. In Richmond, we've got 3 meetings, believe it or not, tiny little Richmond, 2 of which are programmed, and we get together periodically. So it's not a new idea, but it's not one that we appear to be making good use of.
And this is also a great question for some of the workshops this afternoon. There may be time for that. I know the workshop I'll be facilitating on Your Story, Your Turn, that there may be some opportunity there to kind of talk with a small group about this as well. Rashid indicated he could give an example of the restorative Quaker design.
My meeting, Friends Meeting of Washington, is embarking on, I'll say, a gingerly path, and we are at step 4, the brainstorming part, but we have not done it with the entire community all at once. So there are some people, we intentionally focused on friends under 40 and friends of color of all ages in the first circle and the first ideation part, with the meeting understanding that because these are not voices that are typically heard, that it would be the results of those that would inform the rest, and not just let people that have been around for 40 years still have the reins of the same problem. Specifically, though, I forgot to mention what the problem is. We have a balloon payment on the mortgage due in maybe 8 years for America's Meeting House, if you will. And that has a lot of friends concerned about whether we're going to be able to, meet our financial obligations at that time, based on a lot of the things that Barry mentioned in his presentation. When we got together, we realized the problem is not the money, the problem is the connections between people and the connection to the community. So our brainstorming activities largely led to solutions that were about how do we build and develop community stronger, with a belief that the money will come as the community gets stronger.
Thank you, Rashid. That's excellent. Barry, I know you put something in the chat. I assume you would like to elaborate on that.
Thank you, Shell. I just want to make sure that friends walk away with a sense of the success of the OVYM restructuring process so far. Yes, no acronyms. Ohio Valley Yearly Meeting, the yearly meeting of which Paul Buckley, I'm very grateful to say, is a member. When we heard the report from the Ad hoc Restructuring Committee at annual sessions last June, there was active discussion about several aspects of the report, but the group was able to unite, first of all, to accept one concrete recommendation, which was to lay down the Peace and Social Concerns Committee, to reject another recommendation. So we did not lay down the Earth Care Committee, but the Earth Care Committee recommitted itself to some specific things to meet the needs of our constituent monthly meetings. And then it was clear that we weren't ready to lay down our quarterly meetings, but there was a clear sense that if appropriate steps were taken to meet the fellowship benefits and expand upon the fellowship benefits of quarterly meetings, that we very well may be ready to lay them down. In my perspective from the clerk's table, it was remarkable how quickly friends united on extending the work of the ad hoc committee by 1 more year. So it will be 2 years instead of just 1, but that immediately 3 or 4 new friends joined the committee, and all but one friend who had served on the committee, and that one had a medical reason to withdraw. Everyone else continued. So it is now our largest and most active committee. So that says something to me about the value of that committee to the body.
Thank you, Barry, for that additional context.
Thank you for that question. I would say, in short, the big existential, possibly governance related issues, as well as issues, when I say issues of the future, that almost always means your physical plant as well. If you own a property or real estate as a meeting, my background kind of is in governance, so that may be where I was leaning in creating this the way that I did. But I would say anything that's big, feels complicated, and feels like, not to be dramatic, but that if it's left alone, that it could imperil the meeting's future in some way. So that could be a child, a child safety policy. People, getting into unity about that. Keeping a building or selling a building, lack of young folks, and even just racial justice stuff generally. Like if you're looking around your meeting and you're sick of it looking, one way, it is going to take complicated conversations to figure out how to make a meeting diverse in an authentic way.
Thank you. And Diane, I want to just raise up the comments you made in the chat. These are all fantastic talks with lots of information for us to use going forward, because I felt that as well. So thank you for having expressed that. Yeah, this certainly should, this is worth the price of admission itself, and you have the opportunity the rest of the day to go into workshops, and hopefully this will ground you and inform you and give you stuff to work with as you go through the rest of the day. I'm not seeing more questions, so I just wanted to thank, again, Barry and Paul and Rashid. I think these fit together. We had a sense they would fit together well. I think they just were wonderful. So thank you for that, Kai. Thanks so much for the tech help and figuring out a way to make it all work. So I will let you all and myself go, and I know it's lunchtime for me, and I hope to see some of you later on during the day.